Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and seeing a headline that would have sounded literally impossible for most of modern history. Europe has united under one single government. Not just a loose alliance, not a temporary treaty or a shared market or a diplomatic club. We're talking about one government, one central authority, standing right above all the nations that used to define the continent. This isn't just a political tweak. We're talking about a massive civilizational shift. Just picture it. All the flags, the capitals, the borders, the old constitutions, and even those centuries-old rivalries suddenly pulled into one gigantic historical decision. I mean, sure, adopting the euro was a massive leap, but this means fundamentally reshaping national identities. What if the continent that spent centuries arguing over language, religion, borders, and sovereignty finally decided to become one single political body? As we go through this explainer, you'll see that once this happens, Europe is no longer just a collection of countries. It becomes, arguably, the most ambitious experiment in human history. Section 1. The ultimate political merger, designing a continental state. So, to really grasp how massive this scenario is, we have to look at what Europe actually is right now. It's not just one thing, right? It's countless things layered on top of each other. Ancient kingdoms, modern republics, massive states, and tiny ones. The absolute first hurdle here is figuring out how you politically govern a continent with such deep, fragmented historical roots. This wouldn't just be some administrative update. It would literally mean the end of an old order and writing a brand new constitution for hundreds of millions of people. And the founding design of this united Europe, that completely determines whether the whole project feels like liberation or, frankly, like control. Basically, you've got two distinct paths. On one hand, you have a soft federation, kind of like the United States, where individual nations keep a lot of autonomy, while one central government handles the big continental stuff. On the other hand, you could go with a highly centralized system, more like France, with a single capital city and one supreme legislature directing the whole shebang. A soft federation preserves that local comfort, while a centralized system creates brutal efficiency, but inevitably sparks way more political anxiety. Which brings us to a really pivotal question. Who actually gets to run the show? Is there one president, one prime minister, a chancellor, or actually maybe some unprecedented hybrid system? Is Brussels the central capital, or is power distributed across Paris, Berlin, Rome, and Warsaw? The whole architecture of leadership would need to carefully balance legitimacy with efficiency. If power is too concentrated in Western Europe, well, smaller regions in the east or south are going to feel ignored and governed from afar. But if power is too fragmented, the whole idea of unity might just collapse into endless bureaucratic gridlock. When you get down to the day-to-day practicalities, the transition is just staggering. Creating one unified legal framework out of vastly diverse civil and common law traditions, that would be a monumental task. I mean, just imagine the diplomatic arguments over standardizing a European lunch break or setting unified pastry regulations. But on a serious note, it could massively improve human rights protections and business confidence. Think about education. A student in Portugal could seamlessly move through systems in Germany, Poland, France, or Finland with the exact same educational recognition. It's an incredible opportunity for human mobility, though it obviously requires immense care to ensure local stories and regional languages aren't just erased in some standardized continental curriculum. All right, let's step away from the politics for a second and look at the staggering financial consequences here. What actually happens to the European economy when you remove all those internal barriers overnight? Section 2. An unprecedented economic engine, the wealth of a unified continent. Europe already functions as an integrated market in a lot of ways, sure, but one single government would take this to a completely different stratosphere. The combined economic weight of the continent under one unified authority would be mind-boggling. It would create one of the most powerful economic entities on Earth, giving them massive global leverage in trade negotiations with powers like America, China, and India. The crucial point here is the sheer weight of these unified assets working in perfect sync. Imagine absolutely unrestricted labor movement paired with coordinated infrastructure planning. We're talking about things like a high-speed rail network seamlessly connecting Madrid to Helsinki without crossing a single legal or administrative border. Companies could operate across one massive single legal framework, funding massive-scale research and development that no individual European nation could ever afford alone. Trade synchronization and unified regulation would completely streamline business, turning the entire continent into an unprecedented engine for global innovation. But, economic muscle brings some really tough internal challenges. People in highly industrialized tech hubs or wealthy cities, they might feel tremendous enthusiasm for this new system. But agricultural or post-industrial areas might feel completely left behind. If a centralized bank in Brussels dictates policies that accidentally hurt farmers in Italy just to benefit bankers in Frankfurt, resentment is going to explode. Which regions receive the most investment? How do you handle deep wealth gaps between the North and South, or East and West? Unity has to be a lived reality, visibly fair to everyone if it's going to survive without creating deep regional anger. So economic power is one thing, but what about defense? Let's pivot to the immediate and radical transformation of continental strategy. Section 3. One military, one voice. Redrawing global defense. A single European government would literally transform military strategy overnight. Instead of separate national defense ministries and overlapping alliances, Europe could create one single, streamlined strategic command system. The defense power of a united Europe would be extraordinary, simply because it combines vast resources, prime geography, and massive industrial capacity into one cohesive framework. Instead of 27 different armies buying 27 different types of tanks or jets, procurement gets completely streamlined. Intelligence is shared flawlessly, without restrictive national firewalls. Border security is tightly unified, and crisis response is immediate. But here's the catch. The military logic of a united Europe deeply depends on trust. Smaller states would need to know for sure that their specific regional interests are aggressively protected. And larger states, like France with its nuclear arsenal, would definitely want to know they aren't carrying the financial and strategic burden all by themselves. It has to feel like a shared continental shield, not just some imposed military hierarchy. Okay, let's pivot from the practical logistics of the military to what might actually be the most deeply emotional question of all: cultural identity and heritage. Section 4. The cultural identity crisis, balancing unity and diversity. Europe is home to multiple languages, profound historical memories, deep religious traditions, wildly different foods, and distinct cultural styles. A single government wouldn't erase these differences, but it would have to manage them incredibly carefully. People are naturally going to ask if their language remains protected, or if unity just means forced standardization. Diversity is quite literally one of Europe's greatest historical strengths, so avoiding the flattening of these vibrant cultures is absolutely paramount. Public reaction would immediately fracture along a very sharp dividing line. On one side, some are going to see this as the ultimate triumph, a victory for peace and pluralism where a historically divided, war-torn continent boldly chooses unity and collective strength. On the other side, many will view it as a dangerous loss of sovereignty and erasure, terrified that their local identity will be swallowed up by a distant, faceless technocratic authority. This right here is the ultimate test of managing diversity and maintaining democratic trust. The new government would have to definitively prove that continental unity does not mean erasing who you fundamentally are. To actually survive, this new state would have to lean hard into a concept of multiple layers of belonging. Would a person from Spain, Poland, or Greece suddenly just wake up and say they're solely European? Probably not. They'd likely define themselves by their deeply rooted national or regional heritage first, and continentally second. And that has to be totally acceptable. Citizens would need to feel deeply local and deeply continental at the exact same time for this massive new government to truly thrive without sparking major separatist movements. So let's say Europe successfully navigates its internal identity. How does the rest of the globe adjust to this new reality? The geopolitical shockwaves would be instant. Section 5. A new global superpower. The shift in world diplomacy. Foreign policy would become dramatically simpler in one sense, but infinitely more difficult in another. Europe would suddenly speak with one thunderous voice, massively increasing its global influence. But getting dozens of former nations to actually agree on one unified stance toward the Middle East, Africa, or the rest of the world, that requires solving the problem of internal representation. It's the birth of a diplomatic superpower, provided it can avoid paralyzing itself from the inside. The global adjustments to this would be absolutely enormous. Washington, Beijing, and Moscow would have to rapidly adapt to a giant unified strategic entity that can look them in the eye as a total equal. The world's diplomatic balance changes the minute this happens. Complex trade negotiations would become deeply intricate but highly efficient, as foreign nations deal with one massive bloc rather than a patchwork of smaller markets. Even international organizations like the UN would need to radically transform, adapting to a Europe that no longer behaves like a coalition of separate states, but as one massive single entity on the world stage. Ultimately, the most practical benefit all of this integration actually buys you is unparalleled resilience. A continent that can seamlessly coordinate its power grids, transport infrastructure, and emergency response is far better equipped to manage economic shocks, climate disasters, cyber threats, and geopolitical instability. Imagine a climate disaster in the Mediterranean being instantly mitigated by resources and infrastructure mobilized from Scandinavia without a single second of diplomatic hesitation. That kind of resilience is incredibly powerful. But again, it only works as long as the central authority remains legitimate and flexible enough to keep the public's trust. The symbolic weight of this moment? It would be almost impossible to overstate. For centuries, Europe has been a continent brutally torn apart by devastating wars, shifting empires, and tragic conflicts. A unified government is a stunning statement that the continent has profoundly learned from its bloodiest history. It sends an unshakable message that the future belongs not to fragmented, competing power, but to coordinated civilization, choosing lasting peace through total integration. But as we look at this grand experiment in governance, identity, and power, we are left with one profound and lingering thought. Can a continent built from many histories choose one future?